The ceramic container felt warm against my palms as I balanced it carefully while climbing the 3 flights of stairs to Thaddeus's office. The rich aroma of my homemade lasagna filled the narrow stairwell, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought of his face when he saw me standing in his doorway with his favorite meal. After 16 years of marriage, I still loved surprising him, still treasured those moments when his serious, focused expression would melt into pure joy at seeing me unexpectedly. My name is Cordelia Ashworth, and I've always believed that small gestures of love matter more than grand romantic gestures. Making Thaddeus's favorite 3-cheese lasagna from scratch, layering each ingredient with the same care I'd put into building our life together, felt like the most natural thing in the world. He'd been working such long hours lately, staying late at the architectural firm, coming home exhausted and distracted. I thought a surprise lunch might remind him to take better care of himself, might give us a few stolen moments together in the middle of his busy day. The October afternoon was crisp and beautiful, the kind of day that made our small Connecticut town look like a postcard. I'd driven through the winding streets lined with maple trees, showing off their autumn colors, humming along to the radio and feeling that particular contentment that comes from doing something purely for love. Thaddeus had left before 6 that morning, kissing me softly on the forehead while I was still half asleep, whispering that he had an important presentation to finish. I'd made the lasagna as soon as I'd gotten our daughter Penelope off to school, letting it bake slowly while I went about my morning routine. Penelope, our 14-year-old, had rolled her eyes at my plan when I'd mentioned it over breakfast. "Mom, you're so old-fashioned," she'd said, but I'd caught her smiling as she said it. "Dad's gonna think you're adorable." She'd inherited her father's thick, dark hair and my green eyes, along with his practical nature and my tendency toward romantic gestures. Watching her grow into this thoughtful, independent young woman filled me with pride and a bittersweet awareness of how quickly time was passing. The architectural firm of Meridian and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a converted Victorian mansion downtown. Thaddeus had been working there for 8 years, having been recruited away from his previous firm by Jeffrey Meridian himself, who'd recognized his talent for designing sustainable residential projects. I'd always been proud of his work, the way he could envision how families would live in the spaces he created, how he considered every detail from morning light patterns to the flow of daily routines. As I reached the 2nd-floor landing, I encountered Mrs. Pembleton, Jeffrey's elderly secretary, who was descending the stairs with a stack of architectural plans under her arm. She'd worked for the firm for over 30 years and had become something of a mother figure to all the younger architects. "Cordelia, dear, what a lovely surprise," she said, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "Is that your famous lasagna I smell?" "Guilty as charged," I replied, adjusting my grip on the container. I thought Thaddeus might appreciate a proper lunch for once instead of whatever sad sandwich he's been surviving on. Mrs. Pembleton's expression shifted slightly, something I couldn't quite identify flickering across her weathered features. "He's been working very hard lately," she said carefully, very dedicated to his current project. There was something in her tone that made me pause, a hesitation that seemed unusual for someone typically so straightforward. But before I could analyze it further, she was continuing down the stairs, calling over her shoulder, "I'm sure he'll be delighted to see you, dear. He's in his office on the 3rd floor." I continued up the final flight of stairs, my anticipation building with each step. The 3rd floor housed the senior architect's offices, including the corner office that Thaddeus had earned 3 years ago after successfully completing the Riverside Commons project. The hallway was quiet, most of the other architects likely out at job sites or in meetings. Late morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows at either end of the corridor, creating patterns of light and shadow on the polished hardwood floors. Thaddeus's office was at the far end of the hall, his name elegantly painted on the frosted glass door, Thaddeus J. Ashworth, Senior Architect. I'd always felt a little thrill of pride seeing his name there, remembering the younger man I'd married who'd dreamed of having his own office, his own projects, his own professional reputation. We'd met in college, both of us studying at the state university, though in different departments. I'd been pursuing a degree in early childhood education, while he'd been consumed by his architecture courses. Our courtship had been wonderfully traditional, full of long walks across campus and late-night conversations about our hopes for the future. Thaddeus had been serious and ambitious even then, but he'd also possessed a gentle humor and a way of making me feel like the most important person in his world. When he'd proposed during our senior year, presenting me with his grandmother's engagement ring in the campus rose garden, I'd felt like the luckiest woman alive. Those early years of marriage had been challenging in the way that young love often is, full of financial struggles and the gradual process of learning to build a life together. We'd lived in a tiny apartment above a bakery, surviving on love and determination, while Thaddeus worked at entry-level positions and I taught at a local daycare center. But we'd been genuinely happy, spending our free time exploring antique shops and planning the house we'd build someday, the family we'd create, the future that stretched ahead of us like an unwritten story. When Penelope had arrived 2 years later, our small world had expanded to encompass this tiny, perfect person who seemed to combine the best of both of us. Thaddeus had been an attentive father from the beginning, changing diapers at 2 a.m. with the same careful precision he brought to his architectural drawings. We'd moved to a larger apartment, then eventually to the modest colonial house we'd bought when Penelope was 5, the one where we'd created so many happy memories. As I approached his office door, I could hear the low murmur of voices from within. Thaddeus was apparently meeting with a client, which explained why he hadn't answered when I'd called his office phone earlier. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should wait or simply leave the lasagna with Mrs. Pembleton to deliver later. But the thought of his surprised delight when he saw me made me decide to risk the brief interruption. I balanced the container carefully in one hand while turning the door handle with the other. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and I stepped into the familiar space of my husband's office. The room was exactly as I remembered it from my last visit months ago, filled with natural light from the large windows that overlooked the town square. His drafting table sat at an angle near the windows, covered with the precise, detailed drawings that were his specialty. His desk, a beautiful piece of cherry wood we'd found at an estate sale years ago, was positioned to face the door. But what I saw behind that desk made the ceramic container slip from my suddenly nerveless fingers. The sound of it hitting the hardwood floor seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that filled the room. The rich, aromatic lasagna splattered across the polished wood, tomato sauce and melted cheese creating an abstract pattern that my shocked mind tried to process while refusing to acknowledge what my eyes were seeing. Thaddeus was there behind his desk, but he wasn't alone, and he wasn't conducting a business meeting. Reclining in his leather chair, his shirt unbuttoned and his hair disheveled, he was locked in an intimate embrace with a woman I recognized immediately. Vivian Darcy, our neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman I'd considered a friend, someone I'd shared coffee with countless mornings while our children played in our adjoining yards. The woman I'd trusted with my spare house key, who'd watched Penelope during school snow days when I couldn't leave work, who'd helped me plan Thaddeus's surprise birthday party just 2 months ago. She was straddling him in the chair, her red hair spilling over her shoulders, her hands tangled in his dark hair, both of them so absorbed in each other that neither had noticed my entrance until the sound of breaking ceramic shattered their private moment. Time seemed suspended as all 3 of us froze in a tableau of shock and horror. Vivian's face went pale as death, her mouth forming a perfect circle of surprise. Thaddeus's expression shifted from passion to confusion, to dawning realization, and finally to something that might have been shame or regret, though it was difficult to tell in those first terrible seconds. "Cordelia," he breathed, and hearing him say my name while still entwined with another woman felt like a physical blow. I stood there in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, my mind struggling to process this scene that seemed to belong to someone else's life, not mine. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be my husband, my Thaddeus, the man who still brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, who'd held my hand through Penelope's childhood illnesses, who'd built our life together with the same careful attention he brought to his architectural plans. Vivian scrambled to disentangle herself, her face flushed with embarrassment and what might have been guilt. She was fumbling with the buttons of her blouse, her movements urgent and clumsy. "I should go," she mumbled, not meeting my eyes, her voice barely audible above the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. "No," I found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant even to me. "Don't leave on my account. I wouldn't want to interrupt your meeting." The word came out sharp and bitter, loaded with all the pain and betrayal I was just beginning to comprehend. Thaddeus was standing now, his hands shaking as he attempted to button his shirt, his face a mixture of panic and desperation. "Cordelia, please, this isn't what you think," he began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like." A harsh laugh escaped my throat, surprising all of us with its bitterness. "It's not what it looks like? Really, Thaddeus?" "Because what it looks like is my husband having an affair with our neighbor in his office while I was at home making his favorite meal." I gestured toward the ruined lasagna spreading across the floor, the domestic gesture I'd planned as an expression of love now seeming pathetically naive. Vivian had managed to button her blouse and was gathering her purse with jerky, nervous movements. "Cordelia, I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. "I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did anyway," I replied, my voice growing steadier as the initial shock began to transform into something harder and more focused. "Both of you did." I stepped carefully around the broken ceramic and scattered food, moving into the office with a calmness that surprised me. The familiar space that had once represented my husband's professional success now felt contaminated, tainted by this betrayal that was still too fresh and raw to fully comprehend. "How long?" I asked, directing the question to both of them but looking at Thaddeus. "How long has this been going on?" They exchanged a glance that told me everything I needed to know before either of them spoke. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, a single mistake born of weakness or opportunity. The way they looked at each other, the practiced ease with which they'd been together when I'd walked in, spoke of familiarity and routine. "Cordelia, please sit down," Thaddeus said, his voice taking on the reasonable, measured tone he used when discussing complex architectural problems. "Let me explain what's been happening." "What's been happening," I repeated slowly, "is that my husband has been betraying our marriage vows with a woman I considered a friend." What else is there to explain? But even as I said it, I knew there was more to understand. The late nights at the office, the distracted conversations at dinner, the way he'd seemed increasingly distant over the past few months. Signs I'd noticed but dismissed, choosing instead to attribute his behavior to work stress or the natural rhythms of a long marriage. Vivian had moved toward the door, clearly desperate to escape this confrontation, but I turned to face her directly. "How long, Vivian? How long have you been sleeping with my husband while having coffee with me in my kitchen?" Her tears were flowing freely now, her mascara creating dark tracks down her cheeks. 6 months, she whispered, the words barely audible. "It started 6 months ago." 6 months. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. 6 months of deception, of lies, of intimate moments stolen while I'd been obliviously going about my daily routine, teaching my classes, caring for our daughter, planning our family's future. 6 months of them sharing secrets and touches while I'd been trusting and unsuspecting. "The Harrison Project," Thaddeus said suddenly, his voice heavy with something that might have been relief at finally telling the truth. "Vivian was hired as the interior designer for the Harrison Project. We started working closely together, and things just developed." "Things developed," I echoed, tasting the clinical euphemism. Is that what you call it when you destroy a 16-year marriage and betray the trust of someone who loved you unconditionally? Thaddeus flinched as if I'd struck him, but he didn't look away. I never meant for it to happen, Cordelia. I love you. I've always loved you. This thing with Vivian, it doesn't change that. Doesn't change that? The words came out louder than I'd intended, filled with an anger that was building like pressure in a closed system. You think you can compartmentalize adultery like it's a separate project file? You think you can love me while sleeping with another woman? I was pacing now, my movements sharp and agitated as the full implications of this betrayal began to settle in my mind. Every family dinner where I'd invited Vivian and her husband Marcus, every neighborhood gathering where we'd all socialize together, every casual conversation where she'd asked about Thaddeus's work with what I'd assumed was polite interest. Does Marcus know? I asked suddenly, the thought of Vivian's husband hitting me like another wave of nausea. Marcus Darcy, a gentleman who worked as a veterinarian, who'd helped us when our cat had gotten sick, who'd trusted his wife the same way I'd trusted my husband. Vivian shook her head, fresh tears starting. No, he doesn't know. No one knows except us. And now me, I added grimly. Now I know too. The office fell silent except for the sound of Vivian's quiet crying and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I looked around at the space that had once felt familiar and welcoming, noticing details that suddenly seemed significant. The small couch in the corner where clients usually sat during consultations, now taking on new and disturbing implications. The way Thaddeus's desk was positioned to give him a clear view of anyone approaching the door. Had they been careful? Had they planned these encounters with the same attention to detail that Thaddeus brought to his architectural projects? I need to understand something, I said, my voice becoming dangerously quiet. When you've been coming home to me these past 6 months, kissing me goodnight, making love to me, talking about our future together, were you thinking about her? Were you comparing us? Thaddeus's face crumpled with what looked like genuine anguish. No, Cordelia, never. You have to believe me. What I have with you is completely separate from this. You're my wife, the mother of my child, my partner in everything that matters. Except fidelity, I replied sharply. Except honesty. Except the basic respect of not sleeping with other women. I know I've hurt you, he said, taking a step toward me. I know I've made terrible mistakes. But we can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can rebuild what we've lost. 16 years of marriage doesn't have to end because of 6 months of poor judgment. Poor judgment. The phrase hung in the air between us, inadequate and insulting in its minimization of what they'd done. This wasn't poor judgment, like investing in the wrong stock or choosing an unflattering haircut. This was deliberate, sustained deception that had required planning and lies, and a complete disregard for the promises we'd made to each other. Get out, I said to Vivian, who was still hovering near the door like she was afraid to leave but equally afraid to stay. Get out of here and go home to your husband. Decide whether you're going to tell him the truth or whether you're going to let me do it. She nodded wordlessly and fled, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she practically ran toward the stairs. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Thaddeus and me alone in the sudden quiet of his office. The afternoon sunlight was still streaming through the windows, illuminating the mess of broken ceramic and spilled food on the floor, the physical evidence of the moment when my carefully constructed world had shattered. Thaddeus was standing behind his desk, his hands braced against its surface, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. The man I'd married had always carried himself with quiet confidence, secure in his abilities and his place in the world. This man looked broken, uncertain, as if the foundation of his own identity had cracked along with our marriage. Tell me why, I said, sinking into one of the client chairs because my legs suddenly felt too weak to support me. Don't tell me it just happened or that it was a mistake. Tell me why you chose to do this to us." He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I felt invisible. For the past few years, I felt like I was disappearing into routine. Getting up, going to work, coming home, watching television, going to bed. The same conversations, the same patterns, the same predictable life stretching out forever. The words stung because they contained enough truth to be recognizable. Our marriage had settled into comfortable routines over the years, the passionate urgency of young love evolving into something deeper, but perhaps less exciting. We'd become partners in the business of daily life, focused on raising Penelope and building our careers and managing the practical details of a shared existence. "So you decided to have an affair," I said flatly. "Instead of talking to me about feeling unfulfilled, instead of suggesting we take a vacation or try something new together, you decided to sleep with our neighbor." "It wasn't a decision," he protested. "Not at first. Vivian and I were working together, spending long hours planning the Harrison project. She understood the creative challenges I was facing, the pressure from Jeffrey to bring in more high-profile clients. She listened in a way that made me feel seen again." "I listened to you," I said, anger flaring in my chest. "I've been listening to you for 16 years. I've supported your career, celebrated your successes, encouraged you through every difficult project." "I know you have," he said quickly. "You've been a wonderful wife, Cordelia. This isn't about anything you did or didn't do. This is about my own weaknesses, my own selfish need to feel young and desired again. Young and desired." The phrase hit me like a slap, highlighting every insecurity I'd carefully buried over the years. At 43, I was no longer the college girl he'd fallen in love with. My body had changed after carrying and nursing our daughter. My face showed the first lines of middle age. My once thick brown hair had started to thin, and I'd noticed gray strands I'd been plucking out with increasing frequency. Vivian was 5 years younger than me, childless, still possessed of the kind of figure that looked good in the fitted clothes she favored. She had the time and energy to maintain herself in ways that felt increasingly difficult as I juggled teaching, mothering, and managing our household. Had Thaddeus been comparing us? Had he found me lacking in ways I'd never imagined? "Is she better than me?" I asked, the question scraping my throat raw. "In bed, I mean. Is that what this is about?" Thaddeus looked stricken, his face going pale. "No, Cordelia, that's not what this is about at all. You can't think that. Our physical relationship has always been good. This was about feeling appreciated, feeling attractive to someone who didn't see me just as Penelope's father or the man who fixes the leaky faucet. But that was exactly who he was to me, I realized with a sinking heart. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing him as a romantic partner and started seeing him primarily as my co-parent and life companion. When was the last time I'd complimented his appearance or initiated physical intimacy? When had we last had a conversation that wasn't about Penelope's schedule or household logistics or our respective work challenges? The recognition that our marriage had perhaps been failing in subtle ways, long before Vivian entered the picture, didn't diminish my anger, but it complicated it. I wasn't ready to shoulder blame for his infidelity, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that we'd both contributed to the distance that had grown between us. "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of this conversation. "What happens to us, to Penelope, to the life we've built together?" Thaddeus straightened, some of his natural decisiveness returning. "We fight for our marriage. We go to counseling. We do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust I've broken. I'll end things with Vivian completely, never see her again except in unavoidable neighborhood situations. We can move forward from this, Cordelia, stronger than before." The confidence in his voice, the assumption that he could manage this crisis the way he managed his architectural projects, sparked a fresh wave of anger in my chest. You think it's that simple? You think you can just decide we're going to work through this and I'll fall in line with your plan? That's not what I meant, he said, backtracking quickly. I know the decision has to be yours too. I know I have to earn your forgiveness, but I love you, Cordelia. I love our family. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to save our marriage. I stared at him across the expanse of his office, this man I'd shared my life with for 16 years, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. The Thaddeus I'd married would never have been capable of this kind of deception. Or perhaps he would have, and I'd simply been naive enough to believe that love was sufficient protection against betrayal. I need time, I said finally, standing up from the chair on unsteady legs. I need time to think about what I want, what's best for Penelope, what's best for me. I can't make any decisions right now. Of course, he agreed quickly, relief evident in his voice. Take all the time you need. I'll sleep in the guest room, give you space to process everything. We don't have to make any immediate decisions about anything. The casual way he was reorganizing our sleeping arrangements, as if this were a minor domestic adjustment rather than the complete upheaval of our marriage, struck me as both practical and infuriating. Even in crisis, Thaddeus approached problems with methodical efficiency. I moved toward the door, stepping carefully around the ruins of the lasagna that had brought me here. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd come to his office to nurture him, to show my love through a carefully prepared meal, only to discover that he'd been receiving very different kinds of nourishment from another woman. Cordelia, he called as I reached for the door handle. I am sorry, sorrier than I can possibly express. I know my apologies don't undo what I've done, but I need you to know that I regret every moment of it. I turned back to look at him one last time, memorizing this moment when everything changed. If you regretted it, you would have stopped after the first time. 6 months isn't a moment of weakness, Thaddeus. 6 months is a choice you made over and over again. I left him standing there in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal and the mess we'd both created in different ways. The hallway seemed longer as I walked back toward the stairs, each step taking me further away from the woman I'd been when I'd arrived with my surprise lunch and my faith in the permanence of love. Mrs. Pembleton was nowhere to be seen as I descended to the second floor, though I thought I heard the soft click of a door closing somewhere down the hall. How many people in the building knew about my husband's affair? How many of them had watched me arrive with my homemade lasagna and felt pity for the naive wife who still believed in romantic gestures? The afternoon air felt sharp against my skin as I stepped out of the building and into the parking lot where I'd left my car just 20 minutes earlier. 20 minutes that had divided my life into a clear before and after, though I wasn't yet sure what the after would look like. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, staring up at the third-floor windows of the building I'd just left. From the outside, everything looked normal, professional, unchanged. But inside, my husband was probably cleaning up the mess I'd made when I'd dropped his favorite meal, erasing the evidence of the moment when his double life had been exposed. The drive home took me past Vivian and Marcus's house, their neat colonial with its perfectly manicured garden and the tire swing hanging from the old oak tree in their front yard. I wondered if she was inside right now, washing off my husband's touch, preparing to resume her role as the devoted wife when Marcus came home from his veterinary practice. Or maybe she was sitting in her own car somewhere, crying over the end of an affair that had made her feel alive in ways her marriage didn't. Our house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left that morning, but I felt like an intruder as I pulled into the driveway. The key felt foreign in my hand as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar entryway where family photos lined the walls, documenting 16 years of shared history that now felt contaminated by secrets and lies. Penelope wouldn't be home from school for another 2 hours, giving me time to figure out how to compose myself, how to pretend that everything was normal until I could decide what truth to tell her and when. She was perceptive enough to notice tension between her parents, but young enough to be devastated by the revelation that our family might be breaking apart. I walked through our house like I was seeing it for the first time, noticing details that suddenly felt significant. The wedding photo on the mantel, captured when we were both so young and certain of our future together. The family vacation pictures documenting trips to the beach, to national parks, to the lake house we'd rented every summer for the past 5 years. The casual snapshots of birthdays and holidays, and ordinary moments that had seemed worth preserving. In our bedroom, I stared at the bed we'd shared for so many years, wondering how many nights Thaddeus had lain beside me thinking about Vivian. Had he compared our lovemaking to his encounters with her? Had he felt guilty when I'd reached for him? Or had he been able to compartmentalize his betrayal so completely that it didn't interfere with his performance as a husband? The practical questions began crowding into my mind as the initial shock wore off. Would we divorce? Would I need to find a lawyer? How would we divide our assets, our possessions, our time with Penelope? Would I be able to afford to keep the house on my teacher's salary? Would Thaddeus move in with Vivian, or would she stay with Marcus and try to preserve her own marriage? I found myself in Penelope's room, surrounded by the posters and books and carefully arranged collections that reflected her growing independence and developing personality. She was at an age where she was beginning to understand adult relationships, old enough to be seriously affected by her parents' marital problems. Whatever I decided about my marriage, I had to consider the impact on our daughter's emotional well-being and her faith in the possibility of lasting love. The phone rang while I was standing there, and I let it go to voicemail, not ready to talk to anyone about anything. But when it rang again immediately, I reluctantly answered, expecting it to be Thaddeus calling to continue our conversation. Instead, it was my sister Beatrice, calling from her office in Boston where she worked as a family law attorney. Cordelia, thank goodness you answered. I just had the strangest conversation with someone claiming to be your neighbor. My blood went cold. What do you mean? A woman named Vivian called my office about an hour ago, asking about divorce procedures and whether adultery affects property division in Connecticut. She said she was asking for a friend, but she seemed to know a lot of specific details about this friend's situation. She even mentioned that the husband works for an architectural firm, and they have a teenage daughter. The room began to spin around me as the implications of Beatrice's words sank in. While I'd been confronting Thaddeus and trying to process the destruction of my marriage, Vivian had been calling my sister, seeking legal advice about divorce. But whose divorce was she researching? Mine or her own? Beatrice, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. I need to call you back. Cordelia, wait, there's something else. This woman, she was asking very specific questions about how quickly someone could file for divorce, about temporary restraining orders, about protecting assets from a spouse who might become financially vindictive. She sounded desperate, almost panicked. I sank onto Penelope's bed, the cheerful pink comforter suddenly feeling like the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath my feet. I'll call you back, Bea. I promise. I just need some time to think. After hanging up, I sat in the silence of my daughter's room, trying to piece together what this new information meant. Why would Vivian be researching divorce procedures so frantically after being caught in my husband's office? The obvious answer was that she planned to leave Marcus and expected Thaddeus to do the same with me. But something about Beatrice's description of the call felt wrong, too urgent and fearful for someone planning a romantic future with her lover. The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Through Penelope's window, I could see Marcus Darcy walking up our front path, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something tight and purposeful. My heart began racing as I realized what his presence meant. Somehow, he knew. I hurried downstairs and opened the front door before he could knock, not wanting the neighbors to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Marcus stood on my doorstep looking like a man who hadn't slept in days, his kind eyes red-rimmed and his veterinarian's usual gentle composure completely absent. We need to talk, he said without preamble, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something darker. I stepped aside to let him in, my mind racing through possible explanations for his unexpected visit. Had Vivian confessed everything when she'd returned home? Had he somehow discovered the affair independently? Or was there something else entirely that I didn't yet understand? Coffee? I offered automatically, falling back on the social niceties that had governed our neighborly relationship for years. No, thank you. Marcus remained standing in my entryway, his hands clenched at his sides. I know about Thaddeus and Vivian. I've known for weeks. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. You've known? But you never said anything. You've been coming to our barbecues, having friendly conversations with Thaddeus, acting like everything was normal. Because I was gathering evidence, Marcus replied grimly. I hired a private investigator 6 weeks ago when Vivian's behavior became too suspicious to ignore. The late meetings, the new clothes, the sudden interest in her appearance. I had to know for certain before I acted. I stared at him, realizing that while I'd been blissfully unaware of my husband's betrayal, this gentle man had been methodically documenting it. What kind of evidence? Photographs, hotel receipts, phone records, email exchanges between them discussing their relationship and their plans for the future. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Plans that include destroying both of our marriages and taking everything they can in the process. My hands shook as I accepted the envelope, afraid of what I might find inside, but knowing I needed to see the truth. What do you mean, plans for the future? Open it, Marcus said, his voice heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. You need to understand what they've really been doing. I moved to the living room and spread the contents of the envelope across my coffee table, the same table where Thaddeus and I had planned family vacations and helped Penelope with homework, projects. The photographs were exactly what I expected, painful but not surprising images of my husband and our neighbor in intimate situations. But it was the printed email exchanges that made my blood run cold. The first few messages were standard affair communications, arranging meetings and expressing romantic sentiments that felt like violations of everything I'd believed about my marriage. But as I read further, the tone shifted dramatically. They weren't just planning to be together, they were strategizing about how to leave their respective spouses with maximum financial advantage. In one email dated 3 weeks ago, Vivian had written, "You need to start documenting Cordelia's spending habits. Anything that could make her look financially irresponsible in divorce court. I've been photographing Marcus's veterinary records for the past month, looking for any malpractice concerns or tax irregularities." Thaddeus's response was equally calculating. "I've been reviewing our joint accounts and investment portfolios. If we time this right, I can move assets before filing. My lawyer says Connecticut is still technically a fault state for certain circumstances." I continued reading, each message revealing a deeper level of premeditation and betrayal. They had researched divorce attorneys, investigated property laws, and even discussed how to present their affair as a post-separation relationship to avoid adultery complications in court proceedings. But it was the final exchange, dated just yesterday, that made me understand the true scope of their deception. Vivian, I'm getting nervous. Cordelia suspects something. She's been asking too many questions about my schedule. Thaddeus, we need to accelerate our timeline. I'll create a situation that forces her hand, makes her look unstable or unreasonable. Maybe catch her going through my things or having an emotional outburst in public. Vivian, what if she hires a good lawyer? What if Marcus fights the divorce? Thaddeus, then we implement Plan B. We make them both look like unfit partners. Your husband's veterinary practice has been struggling financially. My wife has been showing signs of instability lately, mood swings, paranoia. Any competent attorney can work with that. I set down the papers, my hands trembling with rage rather than shock now. They hadn't just betrayed their marriages, they had been actively plotting to destroy Marcus and me, to paint us as unstable or financially irresponsible to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. My surprise visit to Thaddeus's office today hadn't been the exposure of a spontaneous affair, but the interruption of a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate both of us. "How long have you had these?" I asked Marcus, my voice steadier than I felt. "I got the final batch from my investigator this morning. That's why I came here immediately. I needed you to understand what we're really dealing with." I looked at this man I'd known as a kind neighbor, someone who'd always seemed gentle almost to a fault, and saw a steely determination I'd never noticed before. "What do you want to do about it?" Marcus sat down heavily in Thaddeus's favorite armchair, a irony that wasn't lost on either of us. "I want to beat them at their own game. They think they're so clever, planning our downfall while pretending to love us, but they made one crucial mistake. Which is, they underestimated us. They assumed we'd be devastated and helpless when we discovered their affair, too emotional to think strategically." Marcus leaned forward, his expression becoming more focused than I'd ever seen it. "But they're wrong. We can be just as calculating as they are, except we have the moral high ground and the element of surprise." The idea of plotting against my own husband felt alien and wrong, but as I thought about the emails I'd just read, about the casual way they'd discussed destroying my reputation and emotional stability, something hardened inside my chest. "What are you suggesting?" "First, we document everything they've done, every lie they've told, every asset they've attempted to hide or manipulate. Second, we make sure they don't get the chance to implement any of their backup plans. And third, we ensure that when this is over, they're the ones who've lost everything they tried to steal from us." Before I could respond, I heard the front door open and Penelope's voice calling out, "Mom, I'm home. Something smells really good in here." My heart sank as I realized I'd forgotten about the time. My daughter was home from school, expecting to find normalcy and probably homework help, not her mother plotting strategy with our neighbor, while evidence of her father's infidelity lay scattered across the coffee table. "Quick, help me," I whispered to Marcus, gathering the papers and photographs as quickly as possible. He immediately understood, helping me stuff everything back into the envelope just as Penelope appeared in the living room doorway. "Hi, Mr. Darcy," she said with the casual friendliness she showed all our neighbors. "Are you here to see Dad?" "He's still at work." "Actually, I was discussing a neighborhood matter with your mother," Marcus replied smoothly, his voice returning to its usual gentle tone. "Nothing urgent." Penelope nodded and headed toward the kitchen, calling back, "I'm starving. Did you make anything for dinner yet?" The normalcy of her question, the ordinary teenage concern about food, hit me like a wave of grief for the innocence that would be lost when she learned the truth about her father's betrayal. In a few hours or days, depending on how quickly events unfolded, her understanding of our family would be irrevocably changed. "I need to take care of her," I told Marcus quietly. "Can we continue this conversation later?" "Of course. But Cordelia, there's one more thing you need to know." Marcus stood up, straightening his jacket. "According to my investigator, they were planning to have this confrontation happen next week. They wanted to control the timing, the circumstances, everything about how their affair was revealed." "Meaning what?" "Meaning your surprise visit today disrupted their entire timeline. They're going to be scrambling now, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. That gives us a significant advantage, but only if we act quickly." After Marcus left, I spent the next hour helping Penelope with her algebra homework and preparing dinner, going through the motions of normal family life while my mind raced through the implications of what I'd learned. The kitchen that had always been the heart of our home felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge that my husband had been planning to destroy everything we'd built together. When Thaddeus came home at his usual time, I watched him carefully as he went through his normal routine. He kissed my cheek in greeting, asked about my day, inquired about Penelope's homework. He was performing the role of devoted husband, with the same precision he brought to his architectural work. And I found myself wondering how long he'd been acting, how many months or years he'd been presenting a false version of himself to our family. "How was your afternoon?" I asked casually as we sat down to dinner, Penelope chattering about her upcoming school play between bites of the pasta I'd prepared. "Busy," Thaddeus replied, not meeting my eyes. "Had a difficult client meeting that didn't go as planned." The lie came so easily to him that I felt a chill of recognition. How many other lies had he told with the same casual confidence? How many times had I accepted his explanations without question, trusting in the foundation of honesty I'd believed our marriage was built upon? "Anything you want to talk about?" I pressed, giving him an opportunity to tell me the truth, to deviate from whatever script he and Vivian had prepared for this evening. "Not really. Just one of those days where everything that could go wrong did." He turned to Penelope with obvious relief at changing the subject. "How's the rehearsal going for the play, sweetheart?" I watched my daughter's face light up as she launched into an animated description of her role in the school production, and felt another wave of protective anger wash over me. Thaddeus was sitting at our dinner table, participating in this normal family conversation, while secretly planning to tear apart everything that gave our daughter security and stability. After dinner, while Penelope was upstairs finishing her homework, Thaddeus retreated to his home office to work on what he claimed was an urgent project. I knew now that he was probably communicating with Vivian, trying to figure out how to manage the crisis my unexpected appearance had created. I waited until I heard the familiar sounds of his work routine, the soft clicking of his computer keyboard, and the occasional rustle of papers, before retrieving the envelope Marcus had given me. In the privacy of our bedroom, I spread the contents across the bed where Thaddeus and I had shared so many intimate moments, and forced myself to read every email exchange, to study every photograph, to understand the full scope of their betrayal. The level of detail in their planning was staggering. They had researched both Marcus's and my financial histories, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit. They had discussed strategies for making us appear unstable or unreasonable to divorce attorneys and family court judges. They had even planned how to present their relationship to Penelope, positioning Vivian as someone who could provide stability during the difficult transition period. But it was a series of emails from 2 weeks ago that revealed the most disturbing aspect of their scheme. Vivian had written about researching my teaching career, looking for any parent complaints or administrative issues that could be used to suggest I was an unfit mother. Thaddeus had responded with suggestions about documenting my emotional reactions to stress, creating a paper trail that could support claims of mental instability. They had been systematically building a case against both Marcus and me, preparing to destroy our reputations and our relationships with our children. This wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand. It was a calculated assault on everything we'd worked to build in our lives. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Can you meet tomorrow morning?" "I have a plan," I replied quickly. "Yes, 10 a.m. your office?" "Perfect. Bring everything I gave you. And Cordelia, don't let Thaddeus know about our conversation today." As I put my phone away, I heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly gathered the papers back into their envelope, sliding it under my side of the mattress just as Thaddeus appeared in the bedroom doorway. "You seem quiet tonight," he observed, beginning to undress for bed. "Everything okay?" The irony of him asking about my emotional state while secretly documenting it for use against me in divorce proceedings was almost too much to bear. "Just tired. It's been a long day. Well, maybe this weekend we could do something together as a family. Take Penelope to that new art museum she's been wanting to visit." His voice carried a note of forced cheerfulness that I recognized now as performance rather than genuine enthusiasm. "That sounds nice," I agreed. wondering if he was planning to use a family outing as evidence of his devotion to fatherhood, or if this was part of some larger strategy to maintain appearances until he and Vivian were ready to execute their plan. That night I lay awake listening to Thaddeus's steady breathing beside me, marveling at how completely I'd misjudged the man I'd shared my life with for 16 years. The gentle snores and occasional movements that had once felt comforting now seemed like the sounds of a stranger, someone whose capacity for deception was far greater than I'd ever imagined. The next morning I dropped Penelope at school and drove to Marcus's veterinary clinic, a modest building on the outskirts of town where he'd built a practice serving both domestic pets and farm animals. I'd been there several times over the years with our various cats, and had always admired the calm competence with which Marcus handled even the most anxious animals. His office was small and cluttered with medical journals and family photos, but there was an organized efficiency to the space that reminded me of Thaddeus's architectural workspace. Marcus was waiting for me with a pot of coffee and a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. "I've been thinking about this all night," he began without preamble. "They have a plan, but their plan depends on us being reactive rather than proactive. They want us to discover their affair in a way that makes us emotional and irrational so they can use our reactions against us." "But I did react emotionally yesterday," I admitted. "I dropped the lasagna. I confronted them both. Isn't that exactly what they wanted?" "Actually, no. According to the emails, they were planning to orchestrate the discovery next week in a more controlled environment where they could manage the aftermath. Your surprise visit disrupted their timeline and forced them to improvise." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more determined. "Here's what I propose. We let them think they're still in control. We don't reveal that we know about their larger plan. Instead, we give them exactly what they think they want." "I don't understand." "We pretend to be the devastated, irrational spouses they've been planning to manipulate. We let them move forward with their divorce preparations, their asset transfers, their character assassination attempts. But while they're doing that, we'll be building our own case." I studied Marcus's face, seeing a strategic intelligence I'd never noticed during our casual neighborhood interactions. "What kind of case?" "A case that proves premeditated fraud, emotional manipulation, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. What they've been doing isn't just adultery, Cordelia. It's a coordinated effort to defraud both of us of our marital assets and parental rights." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. "But what if it doesn't work? What if they're better at this game than we are?" "Then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Marcus replied pragmatically. "But I don't think that's going to happen. They're operating under the assumption that we're naive and trusting, the same assumption that allowed them to carry on their affair for 6 months without us suspecting anything." Over the next hour, Marcus outlined his strategy in detail. We would hire our own private investigator to document their current activities and communications. We would begin transferring assets to protected accounts, not to hide them, but to prevent Thaddeus and Vivian from moving them first. Most importantly, we would gather evidence of their systematic planning to defraud us, evidence that could be used not only in divorce proceedings, but potentially in criminal fraud cases. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as our meeting concluded. "We need to protect our children from as much of this as possible. Penelope doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of her parents' war, and I don't want my relationship with my stepson to be poisoned by his mother's actions." I'd forgotten that Marcus had a stepson, Vivian's child from her first marriage. The thought of another innocent teenager being affected by this mess made my protective instincts flare even stronger. "Agreed," I said firmly. "Whatever we do, we keep the kids out of it as much as possible." That afternoon, I hired the private investigator Marcus had recommended, a former police detective named Sarah Chen, who specialized in domestic cases involving fraud and deception. She listened to my story with professional detachment, asking pointed questions about timelines and financial arrangements that I hadn't even considered. Your husband and Mrs. Darcy have been remarkably thorough in their planning, Sarah observed after reviewing the evidence Marcus had provided. But they've also left an extensive paper trail. People who think they're cleverer than everyone else often document their activities in ways that can be used against them. How long will it take to build a strong case? Given what we already have, probably 2 to 3 weeks for a complete investigation, but I can start gathering real-time evidence immediately. That evening, I returned home to find Thaddeus in an unusually good mood, humming while he helped Penelope with her science project at the kitchen table. Watching him interact with our daughter, seeing the genuine affection in his expression, made this betrayal even more incomprehensible. How could someone who clearly loved his child be willing to destroy her family for the sake of an affair? "Dad's been in a great mood all day," Penelope confided to me later as I was tucking her into bed. "He said he's been thinking about taking a vacation somewhere warm this winter, maybe over Christmas break." The casual mention of vacation plans that I knew nothing about sent another chill through me. Was this part of his strategy to appear like a devoted family man? Or was he planning to use a family vacation as cover for some other manipulation? "That sounds nice, sweetheart," I managed to say. "We'll have to talk about it." Over the next 2 weeks, I fell into a strange double life that felt like an elaborate theatrical performance. During the day, I went to work, taught my classes, and maintained my normal routines. In the evenings, I played the role of unsuspecting wife while secretly documenting Thaddeus's behavior and communications. Sarah Chen proved to be remarkably efficient at her job. Within a week, she had uncovered evidence that Thaddeus had opened a separate bank account and had been gradually transferring money from our joint savings. She had also documented several meetings between him and Vivian at locations far from their usual haunts, suggesting they were becoming more cautious about their public interactions. But it was Sarah's discovery of Thaddeus's communication with a divorce attorney that provided the most crucial evidence. Not only had he been planning to file for divorce within the next month, but he had been preparing a case that painted me as an unstable spouse who had become increasingly paranoid and controlling over the past year. "He's been documenting incidents that I can't verify," Sarah explained during one of our clandestine meetings. "Arguments that supposedly happened, mood swings he claims to have witnessed, concerns about your mental health that he's been sharing with carefully selected colleagues." The realization that my husband had been building a false narrative about my mental state while I'd been worrying about our marriage and trying to be a better wife was more devastating than the affair itself. The betrayal went beyond infidelity. It was a systematic attempt to gaslight me into doubting my own perceptions and reactions. "Do we have enough to stop him?" I asked. "We have enough to expose his fraud and manipulation, yes. But the question is whether you want to simply defend yourself or whether you want to go on the offensive." The choice felt momentous, a crossroads that would determine not only the outcome of my marriage, but the kind of person I would become. I could continue to play the victim, react to Thaddeus's manipulations, and hope to minimize the damage to my life and Penelope's. Or I could choose to fight back with the same strategic thinking he and Vivian had been using against Marcus and me. "I want to go on the offensive," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "I want them to face consequences for what they've been planning to do to us." Sarah smiled grimly. "Then we're going to need Marcus's cooperation for the final phase of this operation." The plan Sarah and Marcus devised was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of confronting Thaddeus and Vivian directly, we would let them proceed with their scheme while gathering evidence of every illegal or unethical action they took. When they finally made their move, we would be ready with documentation that would not only defeat their strategy, but potentially result in criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. But first, we needed to protect ourselves and our children from the immediate damage they were planning to inflict. Marcus and I both transferred significant assets to protected accounts, documented our children's emotional well-being, and prepared detailed records of our spouse's deceptive behavior. The confrontation came sooner than expected. On a Friday evening in late November, as I was preparing dinner and Penelope was upstairs doing homework, Thaddeus approached me with an expression I now recognized as carefully rehearsed concern. "Cordelia, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured reluctance. "I've been worried about you lately, about some of the things you've been saying and doing." Here it was, I realized. The moment when he would implement his plan to make me appear unstable and unreasonable. I felt a strange calm settle over me as I turned to face him, knowing that Sarah Chen was probably recording our conversation from the listening devices we'd planted throughout the house. "What things?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he would distort reality to serve his purposes. "The way you've been checking up on me at work, questioning my schedule, going through my personal belongings, the mood swings, the paranoid thoughts about our neighbors and friends." His voice carried exactly the right note of loving concern mixed with growing alarm. It was a masterful performance, I had to admit. If I hadn't known about his larger plan, if I hadn't seen the emails detailing his strategy, I might have been tempted to doubt my own perceptions. "I think you need help, Cordelia. Professional help. And I think we need to consider what's best for Penelope if your mental health continues to deteriorate." The threat to my relationship with our daughter was delivered with such gentle concern that anyone listening would hear a devoted husband worried about his wife's stability rather than a calculating man implementing a plan to steal custody of his child. "You're right," I said quietly, watching surprise flicker across his features. "I do need help. We all do." Before he could respond, the front door opened and Marcus walked in, followed immediately by Sarah Chen and a man I didn't recognize who was carrying a briefcase. "Thaddeus Ashworth," Sarah said formally. "You're being served with papers regarding fraudulent manipulation of marital assets and conspiracy to commit adultery-based fraud." The transformation in my husband's expression was remarkable to witness. The mask of concerned spouse disappeared completely, replaced by the look of a man whose carefully laid plans had just collapsed around him. "What is this?" he demanded, but his voice lacked conviction. He already knew exactly what it was. "This is the consequence of underestimating your wife and her friend," Marcus said calmly. "We've been documenting your activities for weeks, Thaddeus. Every asset transfer, every fabricated incident, every lie you told about Cordelia's mental state." The man with the briefcase stepped forward, introducing himself as an attorney specializing in domestic fraud cases. As he began explaining the various charges and legal actions being initiated, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness wash over me. This was the end of my marriage, but it was also the beginning of something new. I had discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, forged an unlikely alliance with Marcus that had protected both of our families, and learned that I didn't have to be a victim of other people's manipulations. Penelope appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion, her face confused and frightened by the scene unfolding in our living room. In that moment, looking at my daughter's innocent expression, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. "Sweetheart," I called up to her, "why don't you pack a bag? We're going to stay with Aunt Beatrice for a few days while some adult things get sorted out." As she nodded and disappeared back down the hallway, I turned to face Thaddeus one final time. The man I'd loved for 16 years was staring at me with a mixture of anger and grudging respect, finally seeing me as the worthy opponent I'd become rather than the naive victim he'd planned to destroy. "I hope she was worth it," I said simply, and walked upstairs to pack for the future I was going to build without him.